during COVID, Marc Andreessen wrote an essay called Build. And I'm going to read an excerpt. He says, "You don't just see the smug complacency, the satisfaction with the status quo, and the unwillingness to build in the pandemic or in healthcare generally. You see it throughout Western life and specifically throughout American life. You see it in housing and the physical footprint of our cities. We can't build nearly enough housing in our cities with surging economic potential, which results in crazily skyrocketing housing prices in places like San Francisco, making it nearly impossible for regular people to move in and take the jobs of the future." And then last week, Mark and his wife, Laura, submitted a letter to the town of Atherton to fight against multifamily housing, saying, "I'm writing this letter to communicate our immense objection to the creation of multifamily overlay zones in Atherton. Please immediately remove all multifamily overlay zoning projects from the housing element, which will be submitted to the state in July. They will massively decrease our home values, the quality of life ourselves and our neighbors, and immensely increase the noise pollution and traffic." Sachs, I'm just going to hand the mic over.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to defend the residents of Atherton on this. I'm going to take the contrarian standpoint, but does anyone...
I was going to do the same. I thought you guys were all going to bash him, so go ahead.
Well, look, I mean, do we have a problem where housing is too hard to construct in the state of California? Yes, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. The permitting process is Byzantine. It takes years. All those delays cost money. The tenant rights movement has gone so far that landlords basically can't, it's almost impossible to evict anybody. And that makes it so no one wants to be a landlord. So no one wants to build these multifamily buildings or buy them. And then, you've got like all these taxes. So, just in San Francisco, for example, they just passed a 6% transfer tax where, if we talked about this on the show, they basically just took 6% of my home, and there's like nothing you can do about it. So there's a lot of reasons why people don't want to invest in more housing in California. And I think that this Atherton example is sort of cherry picked because what this is really zoning. There are these suburbs, and it's not just Atherton. I mean, you got the East Bay as well, where people live in these areas that are zoned for single family residences as opposed to multifamily. And that determines the character of the neighborhood. Now, if you go buy a house in one of those neighborhoods with that zoning, then that's what you expect to be the case. I mean, you have to spend more money buying a house in that neighborhood because you are investing in the character of that neighborhood. So it is unfair to the residents of that neighborhood for a developer to come along and say, hey, I'm going to change the character of this place so I can make money. I'm going to take a bunch of single family lots, turn them into multifamily apartment complexes or something like that. So I can understand why the residents would be against that. So I would differentiate between legitimate reasons for zoning and then things that the state or cities have done to undermine the market for housing, basically creating frictions or impediments in the market for housing. Now, it is the case that as cities get bigger and need to free up land, that you might need to rezone. But the areas that you should look at for that should make sense, right? I mean, I don't think you go off to Atherton and change the character of that neighborhood so that you can buy 5 more units.
Yeah, I mean,
you should look at, like, why not look at the areas around, say, public transit, like the BARTs and so forth, where you could basically go up around there and it would make sense for the neighborhood.
I mean, the example I would give to kind of paint an extreme picture is, let's say you own a farm in the countryside. Someone buys the farm next to you and then decides they want to build a 50-story tall skyscraper next to your farm. You would have a serious objection because I think that look at the town of Venice in Italy. I mean, Chamath, you've been there recently, but local communities can define the character of their community by making zoning laws that allow a small city to remain like a small city. I've also always been against this notion that we should allow any developer to build any size building anywhere they want in San Francisco, which has been an ardent cry from Silicon Valley progressives for years that we need to let them build. But at the end of the day, I moved to San Francisco 22 years ago, and it was a small, quaint city. It felt like a small city. And building skyscrapers made it more congested, made it less inviting, made it feel more industrial. And it wasn't appealing to me as a resident. And I think that residents need to have the right to define what they want their community to be. The question it brings up then is, where do you build? Because all residents everywhere would want to block family housing, multifamily housing, skyscrapers. So, I mean, Chamath, I don't know if you have a point of view. to counter what we're saying, but how do we think about solving this problem at scale if everyone wants their local communities to remain quaint and interesting and not be built out?
Well, I think that's true for people who can afford really nice homes in the suburbs.
Right.
But there are a lot of people that live in highly dense housing in urban environments. And I think that's where we need to focus first. If you look at the data, California needs to build 3.5 million extra homes by 2025.
That's a rule, right? That's like a...
So David's right, like focusing on a town with a population of 7,000 people is not going to solve the 3.5 million homes we need to build. And it brings up a bigger question, which is then who is going to pay for all the physical infrastructure that's going to be required? Let's just say you're able to actually double the population of Atherton to 14,000. Well, I live near that area. So what I'll tell you is Atherton has bad flooding. Sachs actually used to live near there too. So Sachs can confirm this. Depending on when it rains, huge pockets of water just collect everywhere. That infrastructure is bad. There are no sidewalks. Right? So you kind of walk just on the road. So cars whipping by, could pick you off at any moment. Now, those were decisions that, as David said, the residents of that town made decades ago because of the lifestyle that it created. And they traded away a highly dense urban environment. Whereas if you just moved a mile, south, there are parts of Menlo Park and parts of Palo Alto that are already in a situation to absorb very dense housing where you could put that extra 7,000 or 8,000 people pretty easily.
What do you do when those people in that neighborhood in Menlo Park say, I don't want another apartment building here. I want it to be down the road in Atherton, right? How do you resolve this conflict? And I just want to remind everyone in September, Governor Newsom signed these bills, right? He signed 31 affordable housing bills, which mandate by zip code and by city and by town, the building of affordable housing to create equity in this problem, which basically means all these cities and all these towns are now scrambling to figure out how do we meet our state mandated objectives of new affordable housing in our zip code or in our town.
No, and by the way,
it's
look,
becoming a real threat. Yeah.
I think exactly as you said, what will happen now is it goes to some state commission, and I think that state commission can issue some sort of penalty or something. So, right. it's I think the residents will pay for that freedom, if you will, to not have that building happen. But again, I just go back to, it doesn't solve the crux of the problem. The crux of the problem is we need to solve this housing crisis in the order of magnitude of millions of homes. Okay? And so millions of homes can only be absorbed mostly in cities. So the real conversation, is I have more sympathy for the residents of Atherton than I do for residents of the city of San Francisco. Okay, because there is dense housing in San Francisco. There already is an infrastructure, social services that were designed and built. There are sidewalks. Again, simple example. There are stoplights, in San Francisco that a lot of these towns don't actually have. Now, again, that was a decision they made 50 years ago, and they would have to change that decision. But my point is, there are places that are already shovel ready. And the real question is, why can't we build hundreds of thousands of units? And so this is a good article to write because it's a Tony neighborhood and, there's a few thousand folks. But I think the real issue won't get solved until we figure out how to greenlight hundreds of thousands and millions, because we are 3.5 million homes short.
J. Cal, what do you think? I mean, are you...
Well, the truth here is that this is not about Atherton. This is every town, every city in California is fighting all development, because if you fight the development, well, yeah, you would obviously have less traffic and supply and demand, your homes become more valuable. The place that's fought it most of all is San Francisco in the city, where you cannot convert homes, you cannot take your Victorian and make it into a townhome. And then if you look at what's actually happening here, what they're fighting against, and this is the hypocrisy of it is, these are townhomes. This isn't like a 20-story, giant apartment building. They're townhomes, and they're going to be $3 million each. And they're not going to be for scary people and criminals and ruining people's quality of life. It's going to be the venture partner or the receptionist, or not even the receptionist. It's going to be a venture partner. It's going to be a CTO at a tech company who's going to be able to buy this and then be that much closer to work. And so it does reek of hypocrisy. And there's a really simple solution here, which is there are Caltrain stations up and down the peninsula. There are, in some places, you have other municipal transportation. Along those corridors, they should build up, and they should build 10-story apartments, et cetera. Redwood City did this recently. We've all been there and seen the apartments there. They're gorgeous. They're 6
But
feet.
Cal, you're talking about the exact kind of solution we need, because instead of trying to solve 100 units here or there, Redwood City did an incredible job. They solved it in the scale of tens of thousands of units. And it completely changed the downtown of Redwood City. It's awesome.
And it's awesome.
Incredible.
And
so what is Atherton afraid of? So what is Atherton
incredible.
afraid of? This is NIMBYism at its worst in my mind. I'm not going to specifically make it about Marc Andreessen. I think everybody, has the right to live in the neighborhood they want. They get to state their feelings. I think what we need to do is convince people. And I think there's two really good arguments here. Number one, do you want your chef,
you're
your
saying
kids,
convince people to let their neighborhoods change, is what you're saying.
to let them evolve modestly, to have homes that their own children or their own chefs and housekeepers and associates. We all know people in the area who have bought apartment buildings for their nannies because you couldn't get a nanny or you couldn't get a chef. So you bought some unit in Redwood City and you rented it for your nannies or whatever.
Like we don't know a lot of people that have, not everyone.
I do. I know multiple or who have considered it. And so that's the way you would convince NIMBY people to evolve here. And then there's a second one. This has to do with work from home. When you commute, the issues of domestic violence, depression, drug abuse, substance abuse, alcohol abuse, all of that goes way up. And it's somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes of a commute. You start to see people's quality of life seriously deteriorates. And so if we want people to come back to offices, which Apple just mandated last week, everybody's coming back 3 days a week, like it or not, Tuesday, Thursdays, and you pick the other Wednesday you want to come to work, I guess. If we want people to come back to work, well, we're going to have to build some taller homes. The CEOs, the founders of the companies, the founders of the venture firms, it's not about Marc Andreessen, it's about everybody. They don't have to commute. The office is within walking distance or a bike ride of their office. People need to start thinking about their nanny, their chef, their firefighter, and their employees.
Jason, I may have misread it, but it wouldn't have solved the problem for the nanny, the chef, the teacher, the firefighter.
No, these would be $3 million units.
No, it wouldn't even be that, because the way that it read, because I read it, said that you would have qualified it by building what's called an ADU on your property.
Yes,
so
that's
people would have people would have built it for their grandmother or their in-law.
A lot of people are doing that.
So my point is the law as proposed was already hacked, and so it would never have accomplished what you were saying. I think the answer to what you're saying is what Redwood City did. It's what towns all around the country should be doing, which is like in and around, particularly like transportation hubs, you should be greenlighting a lot of dense housing. But Jason, those are not ADUs that sit on a property.
No.
Those are 500 and 1,000. And by the way, those also require not just the infrastructure, but it also requires the financing and all of the, the banks and construction companies.
The market's there to construct it. That's not a problem in California. The opposition is the problem, which is why the state government's getting involved and superseding or trying to supersede what happens on a local level. That's why Gavin Newsom is passing these things, is because each town is refusing to do it. But another possible solution is if Atherton is so good at blocking this stuff and they have so much money, let them pay a penalty and have Redwood City or San Carlos or another neighborhood, Millbrae, that wants money and they want to build up. Millbrae is building, because that's where the BART station ends, is in Millbrae. They're building up there.
What you're describing are all these contortions in what should be a more free market for housing construction. I mean, the reality is we've done so many things to distort the market.
Agreed.
With these labyrinthine permit processes that delay projects for years and years, to to all the taxes and other
NIMBYism.
rules. Yeah, well,
because that's how they fight it. They fight it with all these environmental stuff.
Zoning is a little different. Yeah, so the NIMBYism factors into the permitting process, but I would differentiate zoning. But my point is just we've so broken the free market for housing that we then come along and say, see, the free market's not working. We need more government mandates. Look, is this happening in Miami? No, go to Miami. There are cranes everywhere. They're building
Houston.
They're building multifamily, or exactly. So in these, frankly, red cities, red states, which are much more lightly regulated, they're building a lot more. But at the same time, it's not
and in New York, which is constrained, so you have to build up.
Yeah. But Houston has no zoning.
Yeah, New York City has always had a very non-sentimental view towards construction. The city has always said, okay, if you want to build something bigger and better, you can tear it down and start over. I mean, they have like air rights and so on that you have to respect. But New York City has never, by and large, they don't constantly label buildings as historic and say you can't touch them and things like that. New York City has always wanted to keep being dynamic and growing. So there are other places that just don't have this problem, and they're able to achieve this growth without building an apartment complex like in the lot next to you if you live in the suburbs and have a single family residence. I mean,
right.
So I just think like, the politicians in California have so thoroughly broken the market for housing. And now what happens is you get an article like this that's basically scapegoating the residents of a suburb as being the source of the problem when they didn't create this problem.
They're just fighting to keep the status quo. So they're perpetuating it, I would say.
But so first of all, I have no special love for Atherton. Toronto, I lived there for a couple of years, and it's kind of like a Stepford community. I mean, I had to move back to the city.
More.
Yeah, well, I'm like, somehow I'm just more comfortable stepping over dirty needles and excrement.
You're voting with your dollar?
Yeah, so I moved back to San Francisco. But
masochist.
Yeah, but look, Atherton's like a really weird place because
it's like Al Pacino in The Devil's Advocate. Go ahead, Sax.
In addition to there being no sidewalks, there's literally no offices, there's no grocery store, there's no commercial real estate of any kind. There is no downtown. So I don't know like where the hook is that you would all of a sudden put an apartment complex. I mean, you're literally going to be building it in someone's backyard. So the character of that neighborhood just doesn't support it. And I think, people coming together to form their own cities, under the principle of subsidiarity should be allowed reasonable freedom to basically construct a city as they want in the way that they want to live.
And there are other cities at competition, Friedberg. There's other cities at competition. Houston has no zoning, essentially. Right. So you can, if you have a lot and you want to make it into a school or a hotel or a restaurant, you can do it. And then outside of Austin, you kind of have that same thing. People build all kinds of weird compounds and stuff out there.
Are you guys following
So it's a competition between those cities. And I think San Francisco is losing.
Yeah. Are you guys following any of the startup cities that are being built where there's like a new city being built from the ground up, and any of those seem like
cul-de-sac, you mean?
I don't know the names of any of them, but
cul-de-sac is one, yeah.
I mean, are these real? Are these real projects? Are we going to see these emerging like next gen cities that, could be viable places to move to and live? Or is it really just about, transforming some of these cities that are less regulatory, and that's ultimately what will win in the market?
Part of why the regulation has gotten so perverted in a lot of these towns is because you've been able to gerrymander how, these public school districts get funded. Yeah. And so, why folks are so protective of it is again, and to underscore one of Sachs's points, this is much more prevalent in democratic states and democratic cities where, coastal elites have really gerrymandered these school districts. And that's a large reason why they don't want a lot of building. They want to protect the tax base, and they want to be able to funnel those specific tax dollars into a few schools for their kids, and that's it.
Yeah.
And so it's actually a really good point, Chamath. People don't know this undercurrent, which is up and down the peninsula.
By the way, this is the dirtiest little secret in these democratic states. Again, mostly democratic. But if you look inside of California and a couple of other states, how horrendously gerrymandered it is, so that you can basically redistrict in a way to cordon off tax dollars, to only then send to one or two public schools that sit inside of your area, your zip code, because that's what the law says. It's a zip code oriented scheme. Is perverse. It's created incredibly horrible incentives for people. So now, I think David is right, which is that there's a contortion of laws that come together that underlie some of these decisions that then manifest in a petition like this, and et cetera. They all need to get cleaned up.
And Chamath, it's even worse than that, because the same people who have rigged it so that all their tax dollars stay in their non-development community, then they're overfunding their public schools. They could easily afford private, but they're using all that money for just their private school. And the one in the town next to it, East Palo Alto, whatever, they have no money. And then these people have the audacity to fight against school choice so that those poor people can take tax dollars and then pick a better school. So it's hypocrisy all the way up and down. And I think this is why people are largely moving to different places around the country. And it's a competition between states and cities.
Okay.